thank you for joining this Talent Minders podcast. My name is Andrew Zach, Talent Minders principal consultant and founder, and I'm proud to bring to you another of our podcasts to share real lessons learned by accomplished HR leaders about how to drive greater value in this 21st century. I'm happy to have a highly successful international talent management and organizational development leader with me on the podcast this week. Dwayne Hammond has held several HR leadership positions at Fortune 500 companies, including CEB, Saudi Telecom, and Alganum Industries, to name just a few. Today, Dwayne is going to share his perspective and experience to help us better understand how the 21st century VUCA world, for those of you who don't know what VUCA relates to, it stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, describing the current and certainly the emerging world business environment, how it's being reshaped, and what it means to exhibit leadership potential in this VUCA world environment. A lesson that every organization will need to understand if they are to remain competitive. Welcome, Dwayne, and let's get started. Give us a sense of your background, training, and expertise in talent management and organizational development.
Yeah, sure. I always feel a little bit strange thinking that my background is talent and organizational development. I suppose it's because I began my career in banking and the contact center, and I worked for one of the major banks here in South Africa. And so it was very much in operational management that I got exposed to leadership and managing people. And even my qualifications, I did my MBA in 2013. It was very much about business management. But it's there where I found my passion, which is unlocking people's potential, managing the organization's talent and helping it to really, release that potential in the talent. So from there, I did consulting with CEB and SHL, really engaging, Forbes 500 companies with regards to their talent management strategies and really understanding what the best companies do. And then, of course, getting some operational experience by managing the talent and organizational development function for two large multinational organizations. That gave me the hands-on, this is how talent and organizational development should work in successful organizations.
Cool. Well, I can imagine that your background in sort of the finance, the banking, and your MBA has helped you with this whole talent management journey.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's, people that are classically schooled in HR sometimes have a communication gap with business leaders. And so that background allowed me to be that bridge between very, very sound and good HR principles when it comes to managing people and kind of the business realities that we're focused on bottom line. It's all about making sure that we get results, but how do you do that using your people, which at the end of the day, that's your key differentiator. It doesn't matter what product you're selling. It doesn't matter what business you're in. If your people aren't pulling in the same direction, the organization's going to fail.
That's cool. And that's what makes it so strategic. That's when you take talent management away from sort of an HR programs management type of role to one that is very much close to the business, very strategic in terms of what is brought about to help businesses ultimately grow. So that's really cool. Yeah. Well, you've heard of this. You've heard of the VUCA world. This for those of you who are listening who have not heard of this, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's really how we describe the world. In fact, it's been out there for about, Dwayne, about 10 years.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
increasingly so. So this VUCA world is making, I think, talent management and OD, organizational development, even more, I think, relevant in driving the business. How have the recent pandemic with COVID accentuated the changes when defining what talent means in a VUCA world environment?
Yeah, I think, some of the things we started to see around about the turn of the century is that organizations started to understand how important it was to really unlock productivity and engagement amongst their people. And that meant more than designing systems or financial instruments to keep the company stable. It meant really understanding what makes people tick and how do you get people to really give their whole selves when they come to work. The amount of emphasis on knowledge workers, on people who have skills and knowledge that is locked inside their head. And if the company doesn't unlock that kind of innovation and that kind of expertise, then they're only getting 50 or 60% from the person in terms of productivity. That was around since the 90s and the 2000s. What has really accelerated because of the pandemic and COVID last year was the amount of trust organizations then had to place in their people. So for instance, the big trend that was happening, in the early 2000s and the 2010s was telecommuting and people working from home. I actually found something from Peter Drucker. You remember the leadership guru?
Yes.
Who back in 1990 was saying that telecommuting is going to be the future and that people are going to start working more and more from home. And offices are going to become more and more redundant. So you already had all this buzz around flexible working and flexi time and getting people to be comfortable working at home. And of course, then with the pandemic, so many organizations, asked their people to work from home, and because of government regulations, you had to. But then also all the kind of prediction models, the way people thought about planning and strategizing had all been based on the idea that, well, let's look at what we did the last year, let's improve on that. But again, taking for granted that all variables stay the same. And of course, the pandemic and the chaos and disruption that caused just threw that out the window. So that kind of very meticulous planning started to be de-emphasized, and it's more about flexibility and adaptability and agility to cope with all these challenges and to readjust at a very short span.
I
don't
know
know if you found that.
Yeah, no, I think we've been in the development business for quite some time, and I think it's really incredible. People are having to almost relearn, from an employee standpoint, how to manage their lives, how to manage their work, how to manage their lives overall, and have that work-life balance with this distance learning, virtual, remote, online, environment. And it's very different, as you know. It's leading to all sorts of challenges, not the least of which is the stress involved. So one can imagine that if we go back and we look at standard competencies, what are the skills and the abilities and the knowledge we need to be successful and really strong contributors at an individual contributor level. That competency structure is going to have to be amended because there's so much that's different that we don't know how to do that will need to be learned. And the same with the leadership piece, right? I think it's almost a transformation in leadership behavior. We've just, I think, touched it at just the very tip of this iceberg, this whole notion of how do you manage a meeting remotely? But there's so much more that I think will probably need to be uncovered for leadership at all levels to be effective. What do you think?
Yeah, no, you mentioned a very good point about leadership. I mean, the construct of what we understand leadership, again, that was changing. People were moving from the old command and control structure to a more transformational leadership style, a more situational leadership style, as we started to understand that we needed to manage people as whole individuals, understand their psychologies and manage them accordingly. And with people now being forced to work from home, the leader is taking less of a, okay, let me see what you're doing and let me understand if you're doing it correctly, and taking on more of that kind of coach and psychologist type of role, where helping them to structure work-life balance, helping them to understand what's important. You know, something I was reading in the New York Times recently, that managers are being encouraged now to set up these Zoom meetings, not to have a traditional meeting, but more just to connect people. Because when you were working in an office, you know, you could pop next door, look over the divider and quickly engage with your fellow employee. But now where you're working from home, unless there is some way that engagement can be facilitated, you often are working alone. So the manager is then encouraged to set up these meetings to get people to connect, and unlock, you know, all of that kind of innovation and discussion that would naturally happen in our office.
That's cool, and I think that's not happening to a large degree. A lot of these managers are still applying the old world conventional wisdom into this new world, and they're struggling. I mean, for example, to your point, you know, how do I follow up on performance? How do I manage performance remotely? Well, I need to set you know, more stringent KPIs, or I need to follow up on KPIs 4 times a week instead of once a month or once every 6 months as I did before, when I could see, you know, Dwayne just down the corridor. And that's not necessarily effective either, because it's, you know, as you alluded to, it's much more than that. You know, it's how do you create an environment, even remotely, where these guys feel engaged, they feel inspired, and you've got this level of trust that keep people working and productive wherever they are and whatever they're doing, you know. And so it's really changing what it takes, I think, to be a really good leader. And it's interesting. I'm seeing that as being sort of a slow, you know, transition, as so much has been slow to change in this area over the years. But I think the companies that really get it and are taking the time and the hard work up front now to really uncover and understand are going to be winning.
Yeah. No, what you mentioned about KPIs is so valid, Andrew. I think, you know, we've often spoken about the poor quality of performance objectives, you know, and smart objectives that were set in the workplaces, even pre-COVID. And I think a lot of the reason that managers and leaders felt comfortable setting very vague and ambiguous objectives is they could actually see the person working. So they felt some level of confidence that they could measure their performance, even though you and I know, you know, that's still very subjective, still very biased and potentially risky. But now the importance of having very unambiguous and clear objectives becomes essential, so that the manager can have that trust that I can't see this person because they're working remotely, but, you know, I'm seeing the results, and that gives me the level of confidence to say, okay, I can back off and allow this person to do what I've employed them to do, you know, to do what they do best.
That's a great point. And, you know, I've had a podcast recently which talked about, you know, the changing role of the HR business partner. And I think this is also a big part of that phenomena as well, that has not really been fully realized. I think, you know, before we had a hard time really understanding that to be a really strong HR business partner, you had to have not only the strong technical skills, but you had to have the leadership skills, the right mindset to be able to challenge the business and so on. But I think it's even gone beyond that now, where the HR business partner, like the CHRO, is really is developing or needing to develop new competencies to be successful, and even more as a change agent. How can we facilitate this change in the business so that our leaders can be much more effective, inspiring in this virtual world? How can I be effective in this virtual world? And so that's, I think, another area that's going to be needing attention.
Yeah.
So
no, those behavioral traits, I think, you know, we started understanding competency models had to go beyond the technical skills and knowledge. and look at behavioral competencies. But in this kind of VUCA world, in this post-COVID world, those behavioral competencies are even more essential. And I think that's also, if we go back to leadership, where a lot of organizations have traditionally made a mistake in terms of what they classify as leadership behaviors and what they look for as leadership behaviors. So that needs to change.
So, it makes the, one of the things that I know you spend a lot of time in is dealing with succession potential, identifying potential, leadership potential in particular. It's got to make that exercise even trickier, I would imagine. And I don't know, I guess you've got to start with almost redefining what potential is if you're going to be trying to identify potential for this future VUCA environment. How would you describe, well, before we go into the VUCA world, how would you describe, how you would define and determine leadership potential? Maybe that's a good place to start, because I know a lot of companies struggle with that. And then we can move on to that VUCA environment.
Yeah, when you're looking at leadership potential, or, from a succession planning point of view, trying to understand leadership capability, the traditional mindset was always looking at what the person has done and looking at characteristics that were always classified as executive presence. And I put that in inverted commas because I did a study with one of the multinationals on executive presence, where I interviewed a group of senior leaders to try and understand how they measure executive presence. And it was frightening, the amount of subjectivity and bias that comes into that kind of measurement, where, you have a lot of, I remember one leader constantly referring to he and him, and, there was a very patriarchal, kind of antiquated mindset that just told me, they didn't really understand leadership capability or potential. But that's very prevalent still and very, very common. So I think from my point of view, the first thing that I look at when I try and understand leadership capability or potential as a construct is to identify basically what the person has done, what you can see, but then what you can't see. And I think if we look at leadership capability, it needs those three lenses: what the person has done, what you can see, and what you can't see. And what you can't see is the leadership potential that we speak about, the under the surface stuff, if you're thinking of an iceberg metaphor, that doesn't necessarily come across in their performance, because maybe they were performing as an individual contributor or at a much simpler level in the organization. So looking at past performance and results doesn't give you that measurement of leadership potential. And I'm sure you'll agree with me, if we think of all the 9 boxes we've come across in organizations that we work with, by looking at performance and potential and then plotting people on the 9 box, that doesn't give you a very good and accurate view of leadership potential. It's a start, maybe, that, if the person hasn't performed in the past, they don't get a ticket to the game. But if they're performing, you then need to look at leadership potential separately. And now this is where, from a potential point of view, I think there's 4 really good lenses to look at leadership potential. The first one is very typical in that it's ability. Are you seeing those leadership characteristics such as persuasiveness, good communication skills, the ability to make decisions, almost more of a typical leadership competencies? So yes, that is important, and you want to make sure that's there. The second lens is something that I personally have seen a lot in my career, where people have those leadership characteristics, but they don't have aspiration. There isn't that willingness to take on complexity and responsibility. So very often they're promoted into positions that they just don't want to be in. And so I think it's important that when you're measuring what you can't see, that you start measuring aspiration. And does this person have that willingness to take on, in some cases, very complex assignments? Then the third lens that I think is quite important is this person really engaged? Unfortunately, we see a lot of mercenaries, people that have those characteristics. Yes, they've got ambition and vertical aspiration, but they're not really in it for the organization or for their team. They're in it for themselves. They don't really have those culture and values that the organization values. And so if an organization makes a mistake and starts developing that individual, they could inadvertently be developing their competition, because that kind of individual will go to the highest bidder, will lead the organization and take all the development that the organization has done, and really use it against them almost. So that third lens is something that I think organizations are now starting to pay more attention to. And then the fourth lens, which I know, from our previous conversations, you were early advocate for, is learning agility. Does this person, beyond the typical constructs of IQ or experience, do they have that ability to think in a very complex world where they adapt their thinking and they learn new things and they understand things that they maybe never had experience with before? Because of course, from the beginning of our conversation, that's a reality. So I don't know, would you agree those are four good lenses?
Yeah, I would. I think it's excellent. I'm just amazed. I love your perspective on why, all these companies, they're basing their assessment of potential around performance. And it's really a strong viewpoint from HR in many respects, certainly the business. Why is that, do you think?
Again, it's people wanting to deal with what they know and what they're certain about. Performance is very quantifiable. It's very easy to say, well, if we look at what they've done in the past, then that will be an indicator of what they do in the future. But unfortunately, especially if you're having somebody transition to a next level of leadership, past performance, again, I use the expression over and over, it's a ticket to the game.
Oh, we've got a...
You've managed...
Yes, we had a little bit of a slip there. It's a ticket to what was that?
It's a ticket to the game.
I love that. That's a great way to look at it. It's a ticket to the game, but that's about it.
Yeah.
It's like thinking, well, I've got a PhD, a master's, everything. I've got all the education. I'm set for success. Not necessarily. I mean, that's a ticket to the game, but there's a lot more to be. So what you've explained in terms of learning agility and everything, you've made it, it seems quite complicated. How do I take this to the business? This is a little bit of a related tangent here, but how would I take this to the business to get them to understand that it's actually more than just performance that we need to look at? How have you done that in the past?
Yeah, look, I think the most important thing is to give very simple examples, examples that are very relatable. I think in most organizations where you've taken your best salesperson or your best customer service person or your best analyst and you've put them into a leadership role, more often than not, they've struggled. And typically the business has kind of done itself a disservice twice over. One, they've put a person in a leadership role where that person is still trying to be an individual contributor. They're still trying to do what they do best. Secondly, you've also removed probably your best performer from your team. So you've kind of, twice over hurt your business. And I think when the business starts to understand that this concept of potential and this concept of saying just because you've been a great performer in the past in your current role won't necessarily make you a good performer in the future, it's really risk management. It's saying to the business, if you understand that, you potentially are putting your business at risk, your bottom line at risk, by taking somebody and making assumptions based on very, minimal predictions, then you are putting your business at risk. And I think a lot of business leaders, they accept that message and they say, okay, so how do we minimize that risk? How can we then we can quantify performance, but if potential is so important, how can we measure that?
That's a great point. That's the $1 million, and it's very, very important. I remember very distinctly a CEO in a company that I was working in at one point. It was a $20 billion startup, and actually it was in the Middle East. But the CEO one day was furious. He called me into his office, and he was basically saying that his succession planning, his bench was complete rubbish, and he was frustrated going to this next round of succession that, the same conversations are held each year. And it's all predictable, and it's all a waste of time. And I'll never forget when he looked at me very angry, this guy, and he said, me, you are putting my business at risk. My business is at risk because you have not, and it just gave a little bit of, perspective that A, it's such an important exercise. B, it can have so much to do with the risk of sustainability. And then C, of course, is when we're looking at potential as it relates to succession, for example, it's much more complicated. And maybe you could help us understand that better, Dwayne, in sort of understanding how can we measure potential? How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, fortunately, this is where science and technology is benefiting us. We've got tools and instruments out there that can quantify the unknown, that can measure that stuff that's beneath the surface. I mentioned at the start that when you're looking at leadership capability, you want to look at what the person has done, what you can see and what you can't see. Now, if we just take a moment looking at what you can see, I think even there, organizations and leaders need to start utilizing very well-proven competency assessments that are out there in the marketplace. Ways that you can create scenarios and simulations that you expose the potential leadership candidate to, and you see how they perform, especially doing something that they've never done before. So I think a start in that process might be scenarios and simulations, and certainly that can help. But a lot of organizations feel comfortable with interviews. They feel comfortable with perspectives from other leaders of what they've observed. So let's move past that. Let's move to the stuff that you can't see, the stuff beneath the surface. There again, you've got science and technology. You've got proven instruments, such as psychometric assessments, that they're not the be all and end all. They're not a crystal ball that, you throw a name into and it comes out and gives you a percentage of, yes, this person will work out. But it is an important indicator. It's another flashlight that you can use to illuminate more about the person that you didn't know before, and potentially allow you to understand more about the risk. So these psychometric assessments, again, they measure different constructs. I think any assessment that claims to measure everything about a person, you have to be a bit wary of. But if you look at an assessment that measures personality indicators, you've got very reputable, well-known and well-proven companies, Korn Ferry, SHL, Hogan. These organizations give very well-researched personality indicators, which again don't guarantee that this person will work out, but they maybe illuminate something about this person's drive or this person's emotional intelligence that you didn't know before, and maybe is a realm you want to explore before you put them in that very kind of risky position. So personality might be one place you look at. Another place you might look at is cognitive ability, and learning agility comes into this as well. So again, these same organizations or others, you have a Raven assessment, you have, again, from Hogan, an assessment that looks at this person's ability to deal with complex information, make rapid decisions, but make decisions that are high quality, given all the information they're exposed to. And I think that, again, somebody, if you look at their performance, you might think, well, they work, let's say, in a financial industry. They have to be very cognitively, a high cognitive ability given the complex work they deal with. But that's not necessarily the case when it comes to agility or learning agility. So they may have, gotten that level of performance because of experience, because they made mistakes in the beginning and they eventually learned and they've gotten to a point where they're doing it well. So if you put them into a leadership role where they're suddenly exposed to information they're not used to, they don't have experience with, you might then find them, again, floundering in the beginning. And does your business have the luxury of allowing that? Or would a cognitive ability assessment say, you know what, this person can actually handle this information that they've not seen before, they've not dealt with before, but they're comfortable and they can make decisions based on that information, and it's the right decision. So these are kinds of assessments.
Okay, putting you on the spot just a little bit, can you give an example maybe of a situation where someone was actually promoted without having full view of their potential and what the consequences may have been?
Yeah.
Either positive or negative. Maybe negative.
Yeah, recently there was an organization where an individual was very well liked by the executive leadership team, very well known, had accomplished some successes in a kind of very strategic role. And so the assumption was made, if we put this person into an executive leadership role, based on past performance, based on the history, based that we all like him and that he's well liked by the chief executive officer, this person will do well. And so there wasn't enough rigor applied to this decision. The person was put into that position and promoted. And at the end of the day, they started to, dismantle a lot of the long-term strategic plans that were in place. Because it was outside their realm of expertise. They didn't have the learning agility to adjust. What was also very interesting was because they realized they were dealing with a lot of complex information they didn't understand, they slowed everything down and kind of stopped any key decisions while they waited for almost the loudest voice to emerge. And that, again, very much dismantled a lot of the good work that was going on and potentially put the organization at risk because there was this procrastination and kind of hesitancy to make decisions that this person didn't or knew that they didn't have the acumen to make. So that, for me, was a very live example of making a decision where you haven't applied the right rigor and you've used traditional but non-effective means of deciding who should be in this key leadership role.
That's very good. That's very helpful. So it's, it's almost like companies, what they do when they think about potentials, they'll come up with definitions around, performance, maybe one indicator. Another indicator could be time and company. Another one could be perhaps ability to move up 2 levels within a period of time. And that's sort of it. And then they'll give those parameters out to the leadership teams and they'll use that to come up with, the people. And so they're missing so much. That's a great metaphor you mentioned, you gave us earlier about the iceberg. There's so much underneath the surface that we're not taking into account. And I think that's probably what happens over and over and over again. If anyone's, listening to what we're saying here, this is something that I really, really encourage people to think about and to try to get right, because it can be so expensive for a company and it can really affect their competitiveness.
Oh, for sure.
I'm just amazed how it's just so difficult to, or why it's not being taken more seriously or being looked at more strategically.
Yeah, I think, again, if you use the metaphor of risk management, the idea of doing that is you're trying to prevent a catastrophe from happening. Now, it's not always guaranteed that that catastrophe will happen, but you're trying to prevent or alleviate that risk. And I think with succession planning, unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't take that same approach. They say, well, if we're doing what we've always been doing and our business is marginally successful, then why should we change? And so there's this thinking that, by trying to prevent a poor candidate from being promoted into a leadership role, that we're doing more work and we won't see the benefit of that, or we may not see the benefit of that, especially if that team or the organization keeps performing. They often don't ask themselves the question of, just because we're marginally performing or there's not a major catastrophe, what are we missing out on? What potential growth are we missing out on because we put an average or even below average candidate into a role that, we could have done more work.
And
so it's again,
it's by the way, and I know my people. Yeah, I know my
yes.
people. I don't need any psychometrics to tell me that Dwayne is great, so don't worry about it. Okay. It's my team. And so, as a last note on this one, I think that one of the challenges we've had over the years in many organizations is we've approached succession or looking for potential against individuals. So, Dwayne has the potential to take on Mary's role. Mary knows Dwayne. They've worked together for, a long time, and Mary trusts Dwayne and Dwayne trusts Mary without any focus on the role requirement. And that's one. The other is that we don't align the role requirement to the business strategy, the business requirement. So we're not aligning succession and the identification of potential, how we identify and look for potential candidates, to manpower planning in a strategic way. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. So maybe if we move away from sort of focusing on people to role capabilities and requirements that are aligned to the business requirements and the strategy, that might help. Because because that is apples and oranges.
Yeah, no, you make an exceptional point, Andrew. I think a key question whenever you're talking potential is potential for what? Somebody might have potential for a leadership role and would be very successful in that role, but in a different context. And if you look at the context, the strategy, the operational conditions of your current organization and the role requirements, maybe that person with leadership potential is still not the right candidate because they're a mismatch for the role. So it's an excellent and valid insight. We need to constantly think, what's our strategy? What does the role require? And match the person to that beyond just looking at characteristics and leadership potential.
You've alluded to this before, but as we look at the VUCA world as it's emerging in the 21st century, do you see that this notion of leadership potential, as we've described it and as we've measured it conventionally over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, needs to change, is changing?
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned early on that the role requirement for a leader, moving from that command and control to more of a coach and more of a, in some cases, counselor even, it means that our focus when it comes to leadership potential needs to move to those behavioral elements and needs to move to the emotional quotient, or EQ, as Daniel Goleman put it. So that emotional intelligence of being able to understand individuals and the stress they're going through, and manage them in such a way that allows them to flourish despite, potentially conditions imposed by the pandemic. I think that's a significant shift that, again, has been accelerated. It was happening, but it's now been accelerated. Something interesting I want to mention to you. I told you before that I'm doing now my second master's in industrial and organizational psychology. And one of the articles I was reading was about working from home. And I think when this started, and even organizations that traditionally had allowed flexi hours and flexi work, there was always a concern that there would be a loss of productivity, that people would do less than if they were on site in an office. And the research doesn't bear that out. The research seems to indicate that people working from home or working flexible hours, they tend to have a skewed work-life balance in favor of work. They don't switch off. They are answering things all hours of the night. They're not spending enough time, decompressing that they might have done if they were in an office and they kind of left the office. And so your role as a leader needs to be helping the individual to manage that work-life balance, to set the parameters, where the typical kind of physical parameters of our office are now lacking. So it's just something interesting that I thought, there was this perception that working from home might drop productivity, and the research isn't bearing that out. There's a lot of people that are working harder and sometimes too hard because they just, the lines between work and life have blurred.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just wondering if there are other things we should be looking for as we stretch our minds and we think out to the 21st century and the changing VUCA environment.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'll keep mentioning over and over again, if you put all your eggs in one basket, it's again not good risk management. So if you're looking at a psychometric tool or only psychometric assessments to give you the answers and to help you really identify, who are these people and where's my leadership potential, you're still not on the right track. I think the truth and answer is always in the aggregate. And what I mean by that is that it's a combination. It's using the assessments to highlight some traits the things you can't see, then engaging with the individual to really validate what you've seen in those assessments and to understand how they've contextualized and worked with some of that information. How self-aware are they, and how much can be developed in terms of that potential. I think also understanding the perceptions of those around them, engaging with individuals to really understand how are they coming across in their engagements. So I know we've talked often about the 360-degree survey and its usefulness and potential issues, but potential advantages too. So getting a view from not just the other leaders in the organization, but potentially from the people that these individuals manage, to understand how they are as a leader, how do they engage with their teams. I think you need to take that into consideration as well. And then, there is some interesting stuff going on out there in the world of assessment. So I mentioned earlier the whole simulations and managerial scenarios that you can then put the person in a very unfamiliar environment and see how they react. Something else I came across, which was quite interesting, is an assessment called cognitive process profile, which looks at not just their ability to deal with complex information, but how strategically are they thinking? Are they seeing systems and patterns? It's one thing if you have a complex problem, you deal with it and you move on. But are you dealing with it, but understanding that it's maybe part of a bigger issue and that you maybe need to go and look at a bigger structural system issue? So I think there's a lot of tools out there for managers and leaders, but again, I always say this, be careful of putting all your eggs in one basket. You know, you need to use your instruments that are available, but you also then need to rely on expertise and experience from those around you. And I think leaders who are becoming more consultative, more engaging with not just their level, but the levels below them, to understand, you know, who are those individuals in the organizations we should be paying attention to.
Well, you've got a lot, obviously, you've got a lot of experience in this area. If I was relatively inexperienced, how do I do this? I mean, you know, how would I get it that I need more data, and I can't rely only on the manager. We've talked about that earlier. I mean, that can be very limiting and dangerous, or certainly risky, let's say. So how would I learn how to do this? I mean, is there a course? Do I call a consultant? What do I do? What do you recommend? How did you learn this?
From our mutual experience, the short answer is yes.
Okay.
I remember we had to deal with a consultant who used to ask these questions, and we get a yes. But no, really all of the above. Yeah. I think, you know, there are certain qualifications and certifications, CIPD or SHRM, gives you a good foundation to understand different kind of methodologies and models that are out there. It's a great foundation. But then a lot of help can come to you from consultants. So not engaging with one specific consultant, but trying to get a range. Because again, the answer is in the aggregate. You know, a lot of consultants, they can come out, they can wow you. It's their job to make sure that you go with them, that you stick with them. But in my experience, what I found very useful is engaging with variety. And you start to get a good sense of what your organization needs and what you need and how you can get those things by engaging with a lot of different firms. And then I think there's a lot of help online as well. There's a lot of kind of message boards and online communities where reaching out to experienced professionals such as yourself, Andrew, and saying, you know, I'm coming across this issue. What are the kind of things I should go and look for? What are the kind of tools that you found have worked in the past? I think there is a lot of help and assistance for people, but you have to make sure that you're constantly learning, you're constantly investigating. Once you've settled on a model and a tool that works for you, don't stop there. You know, go and find out what the communities of practice are doing. The Corporate Leadership Council and CEB have a community of best practice. These kinds of forums can really help you make sure that you're on the right track.
Great feedback. So I'm curious. I wanted to ask you, and I'll ask you it afterwards, but the question is going to be, how do you know that you are actually measuring potential correctly? But that's secondary. The first question is, how can organizations leverage proper assessment of potential to really optimize their succession and their leadership pipeline?
Yeah, and I think the two questions are very attached. So well done there, giving me both questions. You know, I'm a big believer in data-driven decision making. So assessments give you a starting point, but then you have to do a lot of validation. And so I'm a big believer in looking at individuals who you've maybe used these models or tools to then put in their positions, and then tracking how they're doing over time. So you start to validate the instruments and the methodologies that you're using. And using that data to really then, you know, not just look at a lot of organizations, HR, data analytics, will compare performance data, which again is KPIs. But you need to go further than that. You actually need to look at business performance. So you need to say, if we are using these assessments or using these models and instruments and methodologies, once that person is in the position, how is their business performing versus, potentially their predecessor or versus other units. So you really start to then use the data to validate, have I got the right instruments? Am I using the right method? Did I make the right decisions? And if not, what do I change? How do I learn from this and change accordingly?
Cool. Cool. Well, I think one of my personal biggest takeaways from today is that this whole notion of potential, particularly in this VUCA environment, is becoming so important. And it is much more complicated than I had thought before. It's not about what the manager thinks or what the HR manager thinks. And it's really not about trust or even, tenure in a company or in a particular role. It's much broader, and it's a much more strategic evaluation and assessment that requires not only more time, but more resources to really understand. And I think I'm going to be spending a lot more time as a professional on this topic of potential, because it has everything to do with not only a particular process like succession and the success of that and the outcome of that exercise, but really at the end of the day, getting the leadership pipeline right and allowing my business to grow.
Yeah.
Because if I don't understand true potential, then I'm taking lots of chances, right? There's great risk in my pipeline. And so, that really does jeopardize the sustainability of my business. So thank you for that, Dwayne. That's been very, very helpful. As we wrap up today, anything else you think is important that we should mention about potential today?
No, I think we had a very good conversation. Obviously, it was at a very high level, broad strokes, but what you mentioned about potential being complex, that's true. But at the end of the day, I think when businesses start to understand that potential is the really key leverage point in taking their organization from mildly successful to wildly successful. I think it was M. Kitts de Vries who said, you can have all the advantages in the world, the best strategy, best product, and if your leadership fails, it all falls apart. So if that message came through today, I think this was a good conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Dwayne, well, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you again on another of our podcasts. All right, you take care of yourself.
Thank you, Andrew. Take care.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thanks a lot for sharing your immense experience in this area. No doubt you'll be helping others to better identify leadership potential for future roles, thereby optimizing and really, strengthening leadership bench and succession for the future. Thanks everyone for joining us. Tune in next time for another Talent Minders podcast. Have a great day.